Hey guys, so today we're going to look at different wage rates when we're looking at factors of production and in particular the factor of labour. Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at today is why are different workers paid different wages in the economy. So the first thing we need to think about is the marginal revenue productivity of the worker. So a good example here would be a car salesperson, and a car salesperson would make they would have a basic wage, and then they may receive what we call commissions. So that's extra money for each car sold. So the more cars that they sell, the more money they earn. So if we have two salespeople in a garage and one person's really good at selling cars, then they might make more money than the other. The second reason is educational qualifications. So for example, a brain surgeon will earn more money than a nurse because they may have studied a more difficult and specialised qualification. The third one is the nature of the job or the degree of risk involved. So for example, a coal miner will be paid more money than someone who works in a stone quarry. So both of them do the same job. They mine a natural resource from the ground, but a stone quarry is obviously above the ground and a coal miner would work under the ground. They are compensated in their wages for the risk of being trapped. For example, working in conditions that are not healthy, because obviously a coal mine will be dark, it's very hot, they have the risk of carbon monoxide poisoning and so on. The length of training, the training period or experience in the job can also lead to a worker being paid more money. So for example, if we look at public sector workers, they receive pay increases each year. For example, a maths teacher who's been teaching for 2 years will be paid less than a maths teacher who has taught for 12 years. And this is often the case in many different jobs. You can see this in retail work as well, where somebody who might be only working there for Christmas or somebody who's only worked there for a year or 2 years may not be on as much per hour. They may not get as much income as somebody who has been working there 5 or 6 years or who is a permanent worker. And finally, the degree of specialisation. So for example, a vet who specialises in the care of reptiles may be able to get higher wages. They are rare in kind compared to a general vet that looks after cats and dogs and farm animals. Okay, in the video you watched about minimum wage, we looked at the possibility that sometimes minimum wage can be above the equilibrium rate. I just want to talk through that a little bit further now to talk about why the wage rate might be above the equilibrium rate. So if we even look at the minimum wage rate of 10.20, that's the current rate now, if that's above the current wage rate, or the equilibrium wage rate, what we see is that the quantity supplied of labour will be much greater than the quantity demanded. That is, that companies will not demand as many workers as the amount of workers that will be supplied. And obviously if we decrease this wage rate, we would move back along that demand curve, and we'd also move back along the supply curve to a point where they would meet. So then often the question is posed, why is it that we allow our minimum wage to be above the equilibrium wage rate? So just a couple of things on this. First of all, trade unions will have fought for these wage rates, and they may not be willing to allow them to fall in relation to any sort of market changes. So first of all, it's worth noting that the wage rate generally should be close enough to the equilibrium wage rate, but it normally reflects the current market situation. When we look at wage rates, why the minimum wage is often increased, it's often increased because of inflation. This point here. So inflation is where the price of goods and services increase, and therefore it makes the standard of living more expensive, and then the government have to increase minimum wage as a result. Or the workers may have sought for wage increases as well, so they may have fought for them. In order to ensure industrial peace, the government and social partners, the ICTU and IBEC, which is the Irish Business Employers Confederation, have entered national wage agreements, and that would have led to wage increases. As part of these agreements, social welfare benefits have also increased. So sometimes when social welfare increases, like for example at the minute where you have the pandemic unemployment payment. If you see an increase, then often what happens is employers may have to increase the wages themselves in order to encourage people to work as opposed to go on social welfare. And then finally, sometimes you have economic rent due to the shortage of a particular skill. So if we were talking about, we can often see this in very specialised areas, or even just like in broad areas where there's a shortage of skill. For example, construction workers might be in that sector at the minute because there is large demand for housing. The supply for housing is not meeting that demand, and as a result the construction sector really need to increase their labour force so that they can, or how many workers they have so that they can meet the demand. As a result, they may be willing to pay their workers more or higher wages in order to get them to work for them. Okay, so let's look at factors that affect the supply of workers to the Irish economy, but this is the case for most economies as well. So first of all, the size of the population and its structure. So the more people in the 16 to 67 age bracket, the more workers there are. When we look at a country like Japan, if you're to look at the population pyramid of Japan, well, they have a much higher, it's kind of it's like almost like the triangle or the pyramid itself is upside down. They have a much older population, and unfortunately if you don't have the working population or enough people in your working population, that's your 16 to 67 age bracket, then what happens is you have a lot of older people that may need to be supported by the working population itself. The higher the rates of income tax in USC, so if there are higher rates of taxation, they act as a disincentive to work. So they discourage workers from working. Remember we said that income tax is at two levels. So the standard rate is 20%, and then after the standard rate cut-off point, workers have to pay 40% of income of their tax of that income in tax, and as a result it may discourage them from working, so they may decide to work a little bit less. So the last thing to note is the history of immigration and emigration. So EU law of free movement of people allows EU citizens the right to travel to, live, work and study in Ireland without a visa. When the demand for labour increases here, so we would have seen that during the Celtic Tiger, we may see mass immigration to fill the supply shortage. So when we don't have enough workers, we don't have enough people in the working age, then what we see is demand for labour increase, or mass immigration. So that can be immigration from other member states, from other EU states. It can also be immigration from outside of Europe, but those people would need a visa to work in Ireland. Similarly, during the economic downturn in Ireland, people emigrate to countries such as Canada, Australia and previously the UK. We would have seen this. Ireland are an emigration nation, so when things haven't gone so well here, so for example we would have seen mass emigration just around the end of the famine, where a lot of people went to America. A lot of people would have went to Australia when they felt that they really had no opportunities here, they had no work here. We would have seen a lot of people during the 80s then emigrate to the UK when things were quite bad here in terms of our economy. There was no jobs and people needed to work and people needed money, so you would have seen pockets of Irish people emigrating to the UK during the 70s and the 80s. Okay, so finally, one of the things that we need to look at is two types of mobility of labour. So the first one is geographical mobility of labour, and this is the ease of the ease of movement from one location to another, so that labour can move, can live in one area and work in another area. For example, so like me living in Kildare but working in Dublin. So, or even if, for example, I decided to move to Dublin, what would attract me to move to Dublin? So the government have to think about these things, and they have to make sure that these facilities are in place to encourage people to come into the area. So a really good example of this is Tyrrellstown, because obviously you would see with Tyrrellstown it is an enterprise zone, and they're trying to attract people to come to the area and live in the area. So educational facilities, first of all, the availability of schools, colleges, etc. may encourage or discourage geographical mobility, and particularly with workers who have a young family, they will be thinking about primary school, secondary school, college, and they'd be trying to think about where would be easy for them to get into school and to move on to secondary school and then eventually college. Social capital, so I've talked about this before with you. The availability of parks, libraries, hospitals, etc. may encourage or discourage geographical mobility. So if you think of the park at the back of our school, I mean, that could have been used for more housing because, there's so much housing in Tyrrellstown, but it wasn't. It was designated as a park, and that's so that people who live in Tyrrellstown have somewhere to go. And if, for example, you're living in an apartment, you can go and you can walk in the park. So that is something that people take into account when they're looking at where to move. And in relation to moving for work, they will look at things like, is there any social amenities? Is there any hospitals nearby if I get sick? That's really important. The language of the area, so the main language of an area may encourage or discourage geographical mobility. So I suppose when we look at Ireland in general, the whole of the island is English apart from small pockets that are Irish speaking. But that might apply to if we look at, let's say, Canada, where parts of Canada speak English and other parts speak French. Information then, workers might not be aware of the opportunity in different locations. So what happens there is that they would have open days. So they might have like expos in the RDS in Dublin, and an expo is where they have like a workers expo, so where different countries and different companies in different countries come to Ireland, and they try and attract workers to come to their country or to their business in a different country or even sometimes in Ireland and work for them. The final thing we're going to look at is the occupational mobility of labour, and this is the ease of moving from one job to another. So we had just looked at the ease of moving from one location to another for work. This one is the ease of moving from one job to another. So it depends on a number of things. First of all, the nature of the job. It would be very difficult for an office worker to move into manual labour because they may not have the skills for manual labour. And vice versa, so somebody who is working in manual labour to go into an office and start working with a computer. Second of all, the education or length of training, retraining required. So you have, let's say a doctor decides to become an engineer. A doctor may have spent 8 to 9 years training to become a doctor, and then if he decides to become she decides to become an engineer, they may have to commit to a minimum 4 to 6 years of college. So that's going to make the movement of the occupational movement of labour very difficult there. Third of all, you have the availability of government supports. So government funded retraining programs like apprenticeships, mature student grants and retraining courses would assist the occupational mobility of labour and would allow people to move from one sector to another. So why is this important? I suppose when we've talked about this before, it was very important, and an example that we use here, very important at the beginning of the recession, we had an excess of construction workers. And we were short in supply as well of IT workers. So the idea was, is this possible? Can you move construction workers into IT? It'll take a bit of time. It can be very difficult. Is there any other way of getting construction workers into different industries that have more demand for their labour?